In 1891, 8 years after the death of Richard Wagner, Tchaikovsky, Russia's paramount composer and a Wagner disciple, wrote, "As a composer, Wagner is certainly the most remarkable musical character of the latter part of this century, and his influence upon music is enormous. He was gifted with great powers of musical invention. He discovered new forms of art. He led the way into paths until his advent unknown. He was, it may be said, a man of genius, capable of ranking in German music with Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and Schumann. But according to my deep and unalterable conviction, he was a genius who followed a wrong path. Wagner was a great symphonist, but not a composer of opera. Instead of devoting his life to the musical illustration of German mythological characters in the form of opera, had this extraordinary man written symphonies, we should, perhaps, possess masterpieces of that order, worthy rivals to the immortal ones of Beethoven. All that we admire in Wagner belongs essentially to the symphonic order. That in his music, which leaves a great and profound impression, is now a masterly overture in which he pictures Dr. Faust, or is it the prelude of Lohengrin, in which the celestial regions for some of the most beautiful pages in modern music? Now it is the Ride of the Valkyries, the funeral march of Siegfried, or the blue waves of the Rhine in the Rheingold. Are they not all essentially symphonic? In the Tetralogy and Parsifal, Wagner gives no thought to the singers. In those beautiful and majestic symphonies, they are treated as instruments, forming part of the orchestra. Tchaikovsky goes further in diminishing Wagner's musical originality. In the realm of music, Beethoven's style has often been copied to the point of excess, and still is. I mean, isn't Brahms at bottom just a caricature of Beethoven? Isn't all this pretension to depth, power, and strength loathsome when the content he pours into the Beethovian mould is lamentable and insignificant? Even in Wagner, whose genius is indisputable, wherever he overreaches himself, that is essentially a product of Beethoven's spirit. The irony of Tchaikovsky's lamentation of Wagner's wrong path is that Wagner's Novice Symphony in C and the Unfinished Symphony in E are essentially what he refers to as the product of Beethoven's spirit. Indeed, the Symphony in C may be the best symphony Beethoven never wrote, or a plain rip-off of Beethoven's Seventh. Wagner's Imperial and American Centennial Marches and his Polish Overture are forgotten, and the aforementioned Faust Overture is eclipsed by the Bayreuth operatic canon. The symphonic offshoots of Wagner we recognize, the Wesendonck-Lieder and the Siegfried Idyll, are inseparable from the operatic nuclei that inspired them, Tristan and the Ring. It is in opera that Wagner finds his artistic voice and moves beyond Beethoven imitation. Tchaikovsky's mistake, nay, sin in the eyes of Wagnerians, is to conceive of Wagner's works as the works of a mere musician. When you listen to a film soundtrack, when you recognize musical cues announcing and foreshadowing characters, objects, and themes, you are listening to Wagnerian leitmotifs. The symphonic Wagner, whether represented by the Tristan chord, the Overture to Lohengrin, or Wotan's Farewell, is inseparable from Wagner the dramatist. Wagner construed drama, in particular Greek tragedy, as a supreme form of artistic expression. The music is always in service to the drama, to the idea in representation. Hence Wagner eschewed the label of grand opera for the more precise music drama. Wagner's singers are more than simple additions to the orchestra, for Wagner was a poet as well as his own librettist. His poetry must be heard over the music, articulated properly, delivered convincingly as by an actor, and melodically as by a vocalist. The demands of Wagner went well beyond the limits of then-known opera. His mission in life was to present his dramas, his total works of art, pure and undisfigured. But even that was not enough for Wagner. To appreciate his work, Wagner needed Wagnerians. Beyond simple opera-goers, Beyond genuine musical enthusiasts, Wagner required religious converts. In plunging the depths of mythic history, conceiving of an origin story for Germany, there needed to be a German consciousness, a German nation, for Wagner to be its voice. At Bayreuth, 6 years after German unification, Wagner presented his Ring of the Nibelungen. In Bayreuth, there are no segregations, nothing to distinguish between Kaiser and commoner. There is but a congregation, engrossed in a mass for the new nation. Wagner represents the cultural zenith of the 19th century, an artist, a sorcerer, and the high priest of Bayreuth. Wagner was born in Leipzig, while the cannons of the Battle of the Nations echoed in the distance. It is only fitting that Wagner came into the world amid the climactic struggle between the Napoleonic Empire and the coalition forces that forced the French from Germany back across the Rhine. The Germany of Wagner's early life was wrestling with France also for the cultural preeminence of Europe. The 1820s and 30s were the era of Beethoven, Schubert, and Felix Mendelssohn, who had reintroduced German audiences to the works of Johann Sebastian Bach in Weimar, the city of Goethe, and latter of Franz Liszt, the virtuoso and radical composer of symphonic poems. Musical life in Germany was then indebted to the Italian opera. Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice marks the first tentative step towards a distinct German tradition of opera, to be followed by Mozart's Singspiel, the Magic Flute, and Beethoven's Fidelio, though the most direct influence on Wagner and the mature development of German opera was Karl Weber through Die Freischütz and Euryanthe. In Wagner's early operas or apprentice works, Die Feen, the Fairies, Das Liebesverbot, the Ban on Love, and Rienzi, he is nonetheless derivative of the Franco-Italian operatic tradition. Indeed, these works demonstrate a considerable debt to Wagner's musical contemporaries, such as Wagner's original idol, Giacomo Meyerbeer. The conductor, Hans von Bülow, who would later endure humiliation and betrayal at the hands of Wagner, quipped that Rienzi was Meyerbeer's greatest opera. Wagner himself would later exclude these flawed works from his operatic canon. Nevertheless, these operas set the tone in which Wagner was to continue. Wagner composed the music and wrote the librettos for his own operas, in his desire to be both composer and poet. In Das Liebesverbot, he would establish a recurring theme in his later operas, such as Tannhäuser, on the conflicted, dualistic nature of love. The theme of love and redemption through love would find its ultimate expression in Tristan and Isolde. Das Liebesverbot is noteworthy also as Wagner's first and forgotten comedy, the other being The Meistersingers of Nuremberg. In Rienzi, Wagner would demonstrate overt political themes of popular sovereignty, as encapsulated in the opera's protagonist and historical figure, Cola de Rienzi, in opposition to the Roman Church and nobility. Rienzi established Wagner as a composer of note. The man who had become one of Wagner's most notorious detractors, Edvard von Hanslick, praised it as a triumph of grand opera on the scale of Mozart's Don Giovanni. In the aftermath of Rienzi, Wagner settled in Dresden, eventually being appointed as Kapellmeister, or Master of Music to the King of Saxony. The tranquility of life and security in Dresden was fleeting, the eye of the storm that would characterize Wagner's tumultuous existence. He was a megalomaniac, a womanizer, and profligate in extremis. In all things Wagner was enamoured of and dependent on beauty, whether in the pursuit of women, fine silk clothing, or adorning his residences with resplendent objets d'art. In the absence of beauty, Wagner could not function creatively. In the 1830s, he was dependent on the income of his first wife, Mina Plena, a renowned actress who had begrudgingly accepted his proposal of marriage. The marriage was a disaster, replete with infidelities from both parties. Wagner, for his part, was always on the run from his creditors, not above soliciting funds from virtually every acquaintance he made. A brief career in Riga, then part of the Russian Empire, ended with a dramatic escape to London. First across the border to Prussia, where Mina was crushed by an overturned carriage and likely suffered a miscarriage, followed by a perilous sea voyage to London. Wagner claimed that this would later serve as the inspiration for the Flying Dutchman, Die Fliegende Holländer. Wagner's hopes were pinned on Paris, then Europe's and the world's centre for operatic productions. Instead, Paris represented Wagner's nadir, where he was consigned to debtor's prison. After the success of the Dresden premiere of Rienzi, Wagner would go on to produce The Flying Dutchman, the first opera in Wagner's self-acknowledged canon, followed by Tannhäuser and then Lohengrin, The Legend of the Swan Knight, and the first instance of Wagner's exploration of the Grail legend, to be complemented later by Parsifal. Although Wagner did not know it yet, Lohengrin would be his ultimate deliverance. For now, Wagner was set on a course of action that would ruin the security of his life in Dresden. Following the defeat of Napoleonic France, Germany was reconstituted as a loose grouping of 39 principalities under the nominal headship of the Austrian Empire. The number of independent principalities in Germany had been reduced dramatically during the Napoleonic Wars, but the post-war settlement, the Congress of Vienna, and the order of the Austrian Chancellor von Metternich was opposed to German unification, and the implications thereof for the European social order, namely the abandonment of a vertical relationship between prince and subject. In 1848, this order was shaken to the core. Metternich was deposed, and an all-German parliament was elected and assembled in Frankfurt to agitate for the unification of Germany under the Frankfurt Constitution, a democratic parliamentary government under a titular emperor, the King of Prussia, Frederick Wilhelm IV. By early 1849, the revolution in Europe had been all but crushed, yet it came belatedly to Dresden. Wagner had played a direct role in inciting it through his revolutionary polemics. Wagner, in concert with the Russian anarchist and socialist Bakunin, took to the barricades. Russia himself made hand grenades for the revolutionary militia. Nevertheless, the isolated revolution was doomed to failure, and shortly afterwards the parliament in Frankfurt was dissolved and the German Confederation restored. Wagner's dream of a democratic, united Germany was spurned. Wagner was banished from Germany under the threat of a death sentence. Wagner's early exile to Switzerland resulted in the near collapse of his health, only to be followed by an abundant creative flowering. Before his flight from Dresden, Wagner had his first conception of the German myth, the Ring of the Nibelungen, though it was the shorter Death of Siegfried. In exile, this idea developed into a three-part grand operatic cycle, and by 1857, Wagner had completed Rheingold, Valkyrie, and the first two acts of Siegfried, after which the Ring would languish uncompleted until shortly before the Bayreuth Festival of 1876. The construction of the Ring cycle followed Wagner's innovations in musical theory as illustrated in his essays Artwork of the Future and Opera and Drama, where Wagner illustrates his concept of the total work of art, and music as sublimated to drama, coupled with a disowning of opera as then understood, even his previous works. Such music was to be consistent with his German nationalistic aspirations and democratic or Volkisch leanings, the reassembling of an ancient pre-Christian German identity, or as Wagner referred to it as the Horde. Wagner had by now dramatically broken with his previous idol and patron Giacomo Meyerbeer, denouncing Meyerbeer's opera The Prophet. Meyerbeer's career, and by extension Felix Mendelssohn's career, who had died in 1847, was recontextualized by Wagner, as part of a broader problem with the development of German culture hitherto, which Wagner expounded in his essay Judaism and Music. In essence, Wagner decried the peculiarities of alien aspects of Jewish culture as he perceived them, as the antithesis of the art of the future, which would stem from fidelity to this idea of the Germanic horde. Indeed, Wagner argued that the success of Mendelssohn et al. Could only be attributed to the fallen and corrupted state of an inauthentic German culture. Specifically, Wagner stated, "So long as the separate art of music had a real organic life need in it, there was nowhere to be found a Jewish composer. Only when a body's inner death is manifest do outside elements win the power of lodgment in it, yet merely to destroy it." Wagner fixated instead on a new idol, Schopenhauer, through his world as will and representation, though this complicated Wagner's conception of his own work as delineated in opera and drama, in that Schopenhauer elevated music over drama as the supreme art, the ineffable essence of the world. In the aftermath of Wagner's revolutionary, even utopian socialist aspirations, everything had become sublimated to his artistic work, indicating a general pessimism, indeed a belief in the general futility of existence. Art was the ultimate escape from suffering inflicted by the world. Mina had followed Wagner into exile, though their marriage continued to deteriorate. Wagner had found a new patron, the Swiss merchant Otto Wesendonck, who would finance Wagner for years to come. Though it was his wife, Matilda Wesendonck, who had the profound impact on Wagner as the inspiration for Tristan and Isolde, whilst Wagner quietly suspended work on the Ring. Wagner's nascent affair with Matilda was scuppered by Mina, the final breach in Wagner's first marriage. Tristan was radical, scandalous, both in its composition and subject matter. Despite Wagner's rigid adherence to a languorous three-act structure in his operas, little generally happens in terms of plot events. Wagner's gift was in sustaining an audience's rapt attention, even ensnarement in the emotion of the drama, the music functioning as an effective, metaphorical Viagra. Tristan is the most extreme example of this. In its overture, Wagner revolutionizes tonal harmony through the repeated use of harmonic suspension. A leitmotif is introduced without a resolution, building an expectation for a conclusion that doesn't come. The tension presented by the music is reflected in the forbidden love of Tristan and Isolde, a not so subtle indicator of building sexual tension and desire. In the second act, during the love duet, this anticipation reaches fever pitch, anticipating a sexual release, before the dramatic interruption, Rette dich, Tristan. Only in the third act, Liebestod, Love's Death, does the motif finally resolve, having sustained the suspension throughout the 4-hour performance, as Isolde joins Tristan in death. Ertrinken, versinken, unbewusst, hochste Lust. To drown, to founder, unconscious, utmost bliss. An undeniable demonstration of the redemptive power of love and the influence of Schopenhauer's views on suicide, an assertion of will in the face of tragic circumstance, the futility of existence to be joined in death, utmost bliss. Upon finishing Tristan in 1859, Wagner wrote to Matilda Wesendonck, "I fear Tristan will be banned. Only a mediocre performance can save me. A good one will drive people mad." Indeed, upon its publication, it was decried both for its content and its difficulty to perform. Former adulators of Wagner, including Edvard von Hanslick, denounced Wagner as a dangerous radical, pitting him and the co-founder of the New Music, Wagner's friend Franz Liszt, against the supposedly conservative Brahms. Tristan, despite its publication, would not be performed for 6 years. Wagner entertained ever more fanciful ideas to garner this long-awaited success. One such idea was to accept an invitation by the Emperor of Brazil to perform Tristan in Rio de Janeiro. Having left Switzerland for exile in Austrian-ruled Venice, the Princess Pauline von Metternich wife of the Austrian ambassador to France, suggested to the Emperor Napoleon III that he patronize Wagner for Tannhäuser, Tristan's thematic predecessor, rather than Tristan itself. Wagner, with his friend and conductor Hans von Bülow, compiled a new version of Tannhäuser for the Paris Opera, incorporating a ballet in the first act. Despite all of Wagner's efforts and rehearsals, the premiere and subsequent performances of Tannhäuser were sabotaged, in part because the Parisian Jockey Club protested Wagner's refusal to incorporate a ballet in the second act as they had demanded, but more so as a political demonstration against the influence of Pauline von Metternich on the emperor as part of a prevailing anti-Austrian sentiment in Paris. Off the back of the Paris debacle, Wagner wrote his only mature comedic opera, desperate for that elusive success, The Meistersingers of Nuremberg. Finally permitted to return to Germany and Saxony after 13 years in exile, the overture to the Meistersingers was first performed in Leipzig in 1862. Alas, Wagner would take another 5 years to complete the opera. He had more pressing matters, keeping one step ahead of his creditors, avoiding another spell in debtor's prison. Had Wagner died in 1863, at the age of 50, a venerable age for a composer, his legacy would be confined to the Dutchman, Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, and to a lesser extent Rienzi, remembered as Liszt's musical collaborator, and perhaps even the German counterpart to Hector Berlioz, a composer of note perhaps, but far from the musical titan of the 19th century. Tristan, Rheingold, Valkyrie, Siegfried may have languished unperformed for decades as too musically difficult and prohibitively costly to stage. The music of Anton Bruckner, of Richard Strauss, of Gustav Mahler, and countless other composers may have never come into existence. Mendelssohn's premiere of the St. Matthew's Passion in Weimar and the discovery of the Brandenburg concertos in an attic had assured Johann Sebastian Bach's posthumous reputation. Likewise, Wagner could have been spared oblivion after death. Miraculously, though, Wagner would live to complete his most important works, and see them performed to his exacting and extravagant standards in a temple of his own design that would ensure his legacy to this day. The two greatest German states prior to unification were Prussia and Austria, though of all the lesser German principalities, their undisputed leader was the Kingdom of Bavaria. Straddling the historic regions of Franconia, Swabia, the Palatinate, and Bavaria proper, Bavaria and its Wittelsbach dynasty was every bit as ancient, if not more so, than Habsburg Austria and Hohenzollern-Brandenburg Prussia. Bavaria had produced a Holy Roman Emperor, was elevated to the status of one of the empire's electorates, and then elevated once more to a kingdom when Bavaria allied with Napoleon. Despite Napoleon's defeat, the enlarged Kingdom of Bavaria remained, becoming a centre of German cultural patronage under its king Ludwig I and then Maximilian II. The Crown Prince of Bavaria, Ludwig, had become enamoured of Wagner after he saw Lohengrin, envisaging himself and his dynasty through this Wagnerian guise, as the heroic Swan Knight. Ludwig proceeded to read all of Wagner's published librettos and committed them to memory. When Ludwig's father died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1864, the 18-year-old was thrust into power at a pivotal moment in Bavaria's history. Bavaria, as leader of the smaller German states, could have taken a decisive role in German affairs and German unification, as Bismarck was consolidating his power base in Prussia. Instead, Ludwig ordered his personal secretary, von Fistemeister, to find Wagner. When Fistemeister finally succeeded in tracking down Wagner, informing him that the King of Bavaria sought an audience with him, Wagner was incredulous, believing that this was an elaborate ruse by his creditors to ensnare him. Only reluctantly did Wagner travel to Munich, whereupon Ludwig II gave Wagner a near 2-hour audience in his Munich residence. Wagner was awestruck by the meeting, declaring that, alas, he is so handsome and wise, soulful and lovely, that I fear that his, Ludwig's, life must melt away in this vulgar world like a fleeting dream of the gods. The king paid Wagner's considerable debts, and more significantly, bestowed upon him the favour of this simple act of friendship. No official appointment, no responsibilities, though with a salary befitting of a senior civil servant, a house in Munich, and virtually unfettered access to the king, with all of its political implications. Their friendship, as evident through their over-enamoured correspondence, was sincere, but both sought to use the other for the other one's ends. For Ludwig, the patronage of Wagner was the keystone in his grand ambition to see Munich become the centre of German culture, with a world-class orchestra, a new theatre to stage the works of German masters such as Schiller, and of course a new opera house. Wagner's friend Gottfried Semper, who had joined him during the revolution in Dresden, was commissioned to design it. Through Wagner, Ludwig would eclipse the cultural achievements of his father and his grandfather. Personally, Ludwig longed to see the staging of Wagner's works under the direction of the master himself. For Wagner, Ludwig was the only man that could realistically finance his ambitions and sustain him in his extravagant lifestyle. Moreover, his relationship to the king provided him protection, though at a cost of gaining enemies from across the spectrum. The first fruit of this collaboration was the premiere of Tristan and Isolde. Though Wagner's good fortune was in no way dissuaded him from his profligate lifestyle. He had taken as a mistress Cosima Liszt, the illegitimate daughter of Franz Liszt and the wife of his conductor Hans von Bülow. Cosima would bear a daughter, Isolde, in that year. Bülow himself quickly alienated public sentiment to Bavaria through his abrasiveness, chastising Munichers as Schweinhund, after which he was forced to make a public apology. Bailiffs arrived at Wagner's Munich residence on the day of the Tristan premiere, while the hoarseness of Melvina Schnorr, who was to play Isolde, forced Wagner to postpone the production until it was finally performed in June of 1865. The joy of this, a successful premiere of Tristan in Munich, Wagner's first opera premiere since that of Lohengrin in 1850, was undercut immediately by the death of the first Tristan, Ludwig Schnorr, which was falsely attributed to the over-exertions demanded by the opera. Throughout the rest of 1865, the attacks on Wagner mounted. His affair with Cosima had become a public scandal, though the king resolutely refused to acknowledge it, and Hans von Bülow challenged a newspaper editor to a duel over these claims. The scandal was the perfect ammunition for Ludwig's ministers around von Pforten to demand the banishment of Wagner, the hated royal favourite, a wastrel, a Saxon, a Protestant, a former revolutionary, and thus reclaim their influence over the king. The king, faced with an ultimatum from his own ministers, was forced to acquiesce, though so pained was he by the loss of Wagner and guilt over this betrayal that he fled to Wagner's exile in Switzerland and offered even to abdicate the throne and live with him. The king would relent, but their relationship would never be the same. From the Villa Tribschen in Lucerne, a house paid for by Ludwig, Wagner now lived openly with Cosima and their illegitimate children, though he would take the time to complete the Meistersingers. The poor Kokoldit von Bülow was to conduct the Munich premiere of this opera, while steadfastly refusing to grant Cosima a divorce. To deflect from this enduring scandal, Wagner implored Ludwig to publicly disavow the veracity of this affair with Cosima. By manipulating the trust of the king, and by extension damaging the king's authority, in compelling him to deny publicly what everyone knew to be true, exploiting von Bülow, while indulging his affair with Cosima, we understand the moral depths to which Wagner was prepared to plunge to see the completion of his work. Von Bülow's feeling towards Wagner would intensify into total hatred. Only with the birth of Siegfried Wagner would von Bülow finally relent and grant Cosima a divorce. Ludwig also had lost patience with Wagner, demanding to see Rheingold and Valkyrie before the completion of the Ring cycle, the manner in which Wagner had intended them to be seen. Over Wagner's objections, Ludwig staged these operas anyway, causing Wagner to leave Siegfried strategically unfinished, until Wagner could present the Ring to the world as he had envisaged. By 1870, Mina Wagner was dead. Prussia was fighting and winning the war for German unification against France, and Wagner finally married Cosima. To celebrate her first birthday married to Wagner, she was awoken by the premiere of the Siegfried Idyll, a symphonic birthday greeting, Wagner's dedication to Cosima as his muse, the literal mother of his son Siegfried, and the artistic inspiration for the completed Siegfried opera. With Germany united at last, Wagner had his German audience for his German myth, the Ring. Ludwig would be denied his dream to premiere the completed Ring cycle in Munich as part of his glory. Wagner had other ideas. Indeed, for posterity, Wagner's decision to build an opera house in Bayreuth established a uniquely Wagnerian site of pilgrimage, a musical Jerusalem in Germany. The Bayreuth Baroque Opera House had been a candidate for the premiere of the Ring before Wagner decided on the construction of his own site on a green hill. Bayreuth was still part of the Kingdom of Bavaria in deference to Ludwig, though in staunchly Protestant Franconia, closer to Wagner's own birthplace of Leipzig and the new German capital of Berlin. With the king initially refusing to fund this counter-monument to his in Bayreuth, funding was secured through the patronage of worldwide Wagner societies and Wagner's own concert tours throughout Germany. Only when the project was faced with imminent bankruptcy did Ludwig come to Wagner's rescue once more, in addition to paying for his new Bayreuth residence of Wahnfried, a name Wagner coined for where my delusions have found peace. The design itself stemmed from Gottfried, and by that I mean the design of the Bayreuth Opera House, stemmed from Gottfried Semper's design for the Munich Opera House, where dramatic lighting and an opera pit concealed from view. Finally, in 1876, The Ring, with its fourth part of Götterdämmerung completed, premiered in Bayreuth, with guests as disparate and eclectic as the Kaiser to George Bernard Shaw. Despite the monumental cultural significance of the event, not only for Wagner but for the United Germany, Friedrich Nietzsche, who had joined Wagner's inner circle during his exile in Switzerland, broke with him over this, to briefly follow the French composer Bizet. Moreover, the festival was a financial failure. Nietzsche perceived of Bayreuth for what it was, a mass for the new Germany. For Nietzsche, this was both exclusionary and pandering. For all his strives, Wagner was seemingly always on the verge of destitution, only to be saved again and again by Ludwig in his seeming infinite magnanimity. Lohengrin could be seen as the thematic co-saga to the Ring, the stirrings of the Grail legend, to be augmented by the legends of Percival or Parsifal, the origin point of Aryan civilization in India, the subject of the opera The Victors. Wagner hoped that Parsifal finally would bring him success. Indeed, Parsifal would be an exclusive fixture for Bayreuth. Parsifal, while infused with suggestive elements of German nationalism, was consciously Christian, in stark contradistinction to the Ring. Ludwig acquiesced to Wagner that Parsifal would remain exclusive to Bayreuth, on the condition that Hermann Levi, the Jewish Munich court conductor, oversee the performances, much to the chagrin of Wagner, who insisted that Levi get baptized. At the final performance of Parsifal in the 1882 Bayreuth Festival, Wagner took the conductor's baton from Levi and conducted the final act himself. At last, Wagner had a financial success. Though as Wagner would die in 1883, the thematic successor to Parsifal, The Victors, would never be completed. Suffering from repeated bouts of angina, the Wagners wintered in Venice, and following the success of the second festival, Wagner suffered a fatal heart attack. Cosima sat beside her husband's body for a full day, refusing all refreshment. Wagner left no will, but he had left an artistic establishment, a place of pilgrimage, an irrefutable impact on the legacy of music, and a musical dynasty. From 1886, Cosima would direct and maintain the Bayreuth Festival, relying on talented composers such as Hermann Levi. Though Siegfried, the son of Richard Wagner and the grandson of Franz Liszt, could not aspire to the creative feats of his forebears, he would diligently conduct performances during the festival and served as the festival's creative director until 1930. Wagner's grandsons, Wieland and later Wolfgang, would helm the festival until 2010. The Wagner family have remained in charge of the festival ever since.